Hello and welcome to this presentation on turning dreams into reality. My name's Barry Osborne. I'm a congregational minister in the Congregational Federation, and I'm also the area secretary for the East Midlands Area. We have some 31 churches, most of which are relatively small in terms of the numbers attending. And last October we had actually encouraged the churches to think about what would be your dream for your church. What would you like to see 5 years from now? Maybe it's more people coming, maybe it's some other aspect of development, but do you have a dream? So I'm asking the same question of you, and if you have a dream, then we're going to be talking about how do we turn that into reality. Now you'll find it helpful if you've got a piece of paper, something to write with, make notes, and from time to time I'm going to suggest you pause the video and maybe undertake an exercise together. You can watch it straight the way through, or you can use it in that form, whatever you like. And if you're making use of this, why not drop me an email? The address will come up at the end of the presentation. I'd love to hear from you. Now, what we actually did was we based what we're going to talk about on the story of Nehemiah, who was used by God to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem many, many years ago. The people from Jerusalem and Judea had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and the city of Jerusalem had been wrecked, and the walls of Jerusalem were left in a broken down state. And so that's where our story begins, and it ends up very differently in an amazingly short period of time. But it's a story about a missional vision and how that was implemented. So here are some of the lessons that we noticed that Nehemiah had to work through. So there's quite a few of these. I'll just go through them very quickly now. Starts with him getting some news which disturbs him. And as he begins to think and pray about it, he begins to dream. He imagines what the situation could be like. But he makes a personal commitment to be involved himself, even though it means coming out of his comfort zone in order to do it. So he makes a start. But almost immediately he meets opposition, and life is difficult for him. He also goes through a process of assessing what needs to be done. There's a huge job to be done. And he works out strategies, and he develops these and adapts these from time to time. He knows he can't do it on his own, so he needs to envision others and motivate others. And no matter what problems he meets, and he meets quite a lot of problems along the way, he persists until the whole of the process is completed. Now, along the way, he needs to review what he's doing and make adjustments, and he needs constantly to provide encouragement, and at the end of it, he will end up completing the process. So that's the process, and amazingly it was done within 52 days, and so the whole story ends up with celebration. Now if you want to go back to the biblical account, I suggest you do read chapter 1 and give an opportunity to ponder on that, but the whole process is summarised, I think, within the first 8 chapters of the book of Nehemiah, and it ends with a great celebration. So this is what we based our story on, and we didn't have time to go through each of these. You could do that if you wanted to have an away day, and I'd be happy to help you organize and plan that or lead that for you if you'd like me to do so. But we drew on a few of these various points that we've mentioned here. So it starts with disturbing. Nothing would have happened if Nehemiah had not heard how bad things were. He had relatives who came to visit him from Jerusalem, many, many miles away, and he longed to hear what's going on in Jerusalem. How are things back home? And his brothers tell him that things are in a really bad way. The walls are broken down, the gates have been burned with fire, the people are depressed and discouraged. Things are in a really bad situation. Now, I say it again, nothing would have happened if he had not been disturbed by that news. When he heard about it, he sits down and he weeps. And everything comes out of that disturbing. And if we want things to be improved, we want things to develop within our own churches, then it's really vital that we take that on board and we understand that we need to be disturbed about the way things are at the present time. You know, it's ever so easy to be complacent. Somebody once said the difference between a rut and a grave is a matter of degree. And we can become comfortable the way things are. We cope, we're managing. So we're actually in a rut, but the difference between a rut and a grave is just a matter of degree. And if things don't change, if there isn't growth, if we're not seeing people brought to Christ and seeing the church grow numerically, well, sooner or later it's likely to fade away. I like this quote also from Jimmy Carter, who talks about the teaching of Christ. He says, I hate to see complacency prevail in our lives when it's so directly contrary to the teaching of Christ. I think that's an amazing statement there. So Nehemiah steps out, and if we're going to do anything, it will call upon us also to be prepared to take a step to do something about it. It's fine to be praying, and prayer is really important, but we need to do something about it. But of course, there are many of us who find ourselves in churches where people are happy with the way things are, don't particularly want anything to change. So how about you personally? On a piece of paper, I'd like you to work this out. On a scale of 0 to 5, how satisfied are you with the life of your church today? This is you personally. Okay, how satisfied are you with the life of your church today? Now, if you're very satisfied, score it 5. If you're not really satisfied, score it 0. Okay, so how satisfied are you? If you're satisfied, fully satisfied, it's a 5. If you're dissatisfied, it's a 0. But it's not just about you, is it? What about the rest of the people in your church? How satisfied do you think the majority of your church are? So this is a way of getting some idea, a handle on the issue of complacency, which will hold us back from being the kind of church God wants us to be. So you take a moment and work those things. And then you might like to pause the presentation and have a conversation with your neighbours and just see what other people are thinking. See if you're all of one heart and one mind. So pause the presentation and have that conversation. So moving on. What's your dream or your vision for your church? Is it to see more people come to faith in Christ? You're wanting to see your church grow? Is there some other aspect that you're concerned about? Well, the way things were was disturbing Nehemiah, but he had a vision of what he hoped it would become. So he could imagine the walls having been rebuilt, the gates having been repaired and rehung, and find a community living within the walls of Jerusalem that was alive and exciting. So that was his dream. Now, this is really about being missional. And lots of people struggle with the concept of missional church. Some people would say it's potty. So here's a thought about being potty. Do you have a mission statement for your church? Why do you exist? Have you written down a statement that says the name of your church exists for or to? So it might be to share the good news of Jesus Christ within our local community, or it might be a place for Christians to be nurtured in their faith and disciple and expand the kingdom of God. But a single sentence, purpose, is so helpful. So P stands for purpose. O stands for objectives. Okay, so the overall simple statement of purpose needs to be broken down to key objectives that you need to have in order to achieve the purpose for which you exist. And T stands for task. What are the immediate things that you need to do if you are going to achieve your objectives and fulfill this vision that you have, this sense of purpose? So again, this is something that you could organize within your church and to do an exercise collectively to define your purpose, your objectives and your tasks. Now this whole concept about doing things together is important. Many years ago I used to undertake special missional activities for churches across the denominations, and sometimes the church leaders, the ministers or the vicars would contact us and say, we have a few very keen people who would like to do something really special in this area. Can you come and talk to them? And I would say, well, I can come and talk to them, but rather than talk to just a few people who are already keen, what are the possibilities of meeting with, if possible, the whole of your congregation, your regular congregation, and working on a program with them? And it's so important that you do involve as many people in your church as possible. moving on. Let's just take, for instance, the issue of church attendance. Maybe that's your dream. Would you like to see your congregation doubled or increasing by a certain percentage? What's the possibility? Is there room for your church to grow? Well, we've done some research, so here's some information that might be helpful. We can be reasonably confident that it's quite possible that 5% of your local population in the UK will be attending church on a Sunday. So 5% of the population, how many churches are there in your local community? And so what's the average number if you take that 5% of the population and work that out? So I've done a little bit of thinking, so here are some figures for you that you can use. In the first example, it's a village situation, and it's a real village where actually I was the minister. The population was 780, so 5% of that, and then there were 3 local places of worship. One was a Catholic church, one was an Anglican parish church, and the third one was a congregational chapel. So the Catholics, most of the congregation there came from outside the community, only a few people from the community, but there were also churches in a nearby large town, and so people used to go there. So we treated it as if there were 3, so population times 5% divided by 3 came out at 13. So if we were smaller than 13, well, there's certainly room to grow. Well, the good news was we started with 2 and we grew up to about 20. That later settled back to about 15, so that's again quite encouraging. Now, the second example is of a town with a population of 22,000. So 5% of that, and then 10 local churches. So what's the average attendance likely to be? The answer is 110. Now, some were likely to be bigger than others. Some might be smaller. The same in the rural church. We'd expect the parish church to get a bigger attendance than the congregational chapel. So some adjustment either way. So if it's 5% and there are 3 churches in a rural situation and one is the parish church, that might get 3% attending it and 2% for the local chapel. In the town situation, there'd be some churches that would be particularly popular, so they would have more than 110 people there, and others less popular would be small. But that would give a target to aim at. Now, that's not the optimum. That's not the maximum number. You don't reach that number and sit back and say, hey, hallelujah, we've reached the number, let's stop. It's really just to talk about what is the potential. And if your potential, if you do the maths for your own community and it comes out at a figure significantly more than your current congregation, then that's your vision. That's the driving force. That's where you're going to aim. And when you've reached that, well, keep on growing. Or maybe divide into more than one congregation. Lots of possibilities. So there's potential there. Don't settle for small numbers. So Nehemiah is disturbed and he has a dream and he has a passion in his heart to do something about it. And I want to ask, is there a passion for the lost? You're probably familiar with this image of the shepherd with the sheep on his shoulders. And of course, this is based on one of the parables about things that are lost or people that are lost that are mentioned in Luke's gospel. And we have a lost coin, a lost sheep, and a lost son. And in each of these, the stories end up with the lost being found and there being rejoicing at a party, a celebration, and the words about the rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents. Now, there's lots of parallels in these stories, different aspects about lostness that we can draw on. There's all sorts of things. But one of the issues is that there is a passion. So the woman who's lost a coin gets a broom and she diligently searches. I can imagine her moving the furniture and diligently searching, looking with a candlelight and with a broom until she finds the coin that she had lost. The shepherd had 100 sheep and he's missing one. So he leaves the 99 safely while he goes in search of the one. He's not going to be happy. He's not complacent about the situation. 99 isn't enough. And he goes looking for the one sheep that might be in danger. So he goes and looks for it and rescues it and brings it back home. And as far as the son is concerned, the prodigal son, well, when he comes to his senses and he returns, we find that his father runs out to meet him. So in each of these situations, there is passion. And in the days gone by, we used to talk about having a passion for the lost, being concerned about helping people come to know Jesus Christ as their personal Saviour. That this is an important thing. We want people to know Jesus, to rejoice in that relationship with Him, to be sure of sins forgiven and a place in Heaven. All of those things are so important. But in so many of our churches, we've lost the passion. And if we've lost the passion, why is that? How do we get that back? There are issues there that we need to think through. You can pause and have a conversation about that if you like, or else move on with me. Now, one of the great things about the story of Nehemiah is prayer. Much of chapter 1 is actually a prayer that Nehemiah prays. And in that prayer, he acknowledges the reason, the problem that they got. He puts that into his prayer and he says this is because of the sins that he and his people have committed. So he identifies, he acknowledges culpability. It's not just somebody else's fault. He's prepared to acknowledge where he fits into this as well. And then he seeks God's help based on his covenant promises. And many years before, God had given a promise that he would restore his people. So he comes back and he claims that promise. Now there's some good key points about prayer there that are well worth noting down. And if you carry on reading through the story of Nehemiah, you'll find that every time he hits a problem or a difficulty or he comes up against an opportunity, he prays into it. And when he gets difficulties and oppositions, he prays against the opposition. So those two things are important. Are you praying into the opportunity for your church as you seek to be a witness for Christ in your community? Is there anything that's hindering that? Are you praying against that? So important that we focus our prayers. Now, for Nehemiah, he hit difficulties and oppositions. There were characters who were already living in the area that had vested interest in keeping things the way they were, who were not interested in Nehemiah and the strengthening of the people of Israel. So these two characters soon, because they were disturbed, start to campaign, and they oppose the work. They threaten the work. They seek to undermine it in all sorts of ways. They seek to bring Nehemiah into a compromise. All of these things he's seeking to do. And I want to say that if you've got a vision for things to change in your church, for things to be better or different in your church, I want to say that you're likely to run into opposition. And it may well be that there are some who have vested interests. You know, Sanballat and Tobiah had power bases in the area, and they didn't want to give up their authority and their power. They would also had means of getting income. They didn't want to lose that either. So the financial issues, and there are all sorts of things that do cause problems. But we need to identify in our own situation, with the vision that we have and that we're praying into, where might there be difficulty? Where might there be opposition? Where might there be resistance from change? Who is involved in that difficulty or opposition? And what can we do about it? Now, if there's going to be change in your church, and that's what your dream is, that there will be change, well then I want to say change should always be managed. Don't think you can launch into a new program, everything will be fine. You need to have a plan and you need to know how to manage change. So that's a big topic. Again, not enough time in this presentation to go into it in detail. Could spend quite a long time looking at how to effectively manage change in churches. And I'd be happy to help you. We have presentations, other presentations, or an away day, any of these things, happily come and do some work with you. Just contact me, please. The contact details right at the end presentation. Now makes his start. So here's a quote from Nehemiah explaining what he did when he finally arrived. When he left the presence of the king, he'd prayed into that situation, and the king had asked him why he was looking sad. Again, he prays into it, and the king agrees to release him. Not only to release him, but he gives him resources that he can use and soldiers to see him safely through. But having arrived, he goes out at night time when he can do it secretly. He goes around, starts at the valley gate, and he goes all the way around the walls of the city from the outside, just looking. Sometimes when he comes to certain places, he can't even get through. It's so full of rubble. But he goes through and he examines it all. And he starts to develop a strategy. What he knows is he cannot effect this change, this development that he longs for. He cannot effect it on his own. So he needs to share the vision, and not only sharing the vision, but he needs to motivate people. So this is what we read about what he does. He gathers together all the important people and the not so important people in the community, who all of them are going to be involved in the work. They're all going to roll their sleeves up and do something about sorting this out. And he explains why they need to do something about it and encourages them. And he also witnesses or testifies to the fact that God has already been bringing blessing. And they are inspired and they say, okay, come on, let's do this work. Now, I mentioned earlier about the importance of maximizing involvement. And if you read this passage in Nehemiah, just see all the different people that he gets there. He gathers as many people as possible, shares the vision with as many people as possible, seeks to motivate as many people as possible. Doesn't just work with a few that may be easier to move, already, wanting something. He gets everybody involved. It's a real lesson there for us today. Talking about lessons, these are two important lessons I learned. Many years ago, I met Dr. Donald McGavran, who was the founding father of the Church Growth Movement, and I was one of the founding members of the British Church Growth Association. And Dr. McGavran said on one occasion when I heard him, he said, the reason most churches fail to grow is because they're busy doing things they should do at the expense of the things they must do. Now, sometimes I tease churches when I go to take services and I ask them a question. How are you getting on with the job that Jesus left you to do? Now, there's only one job that Jesus left us to do. That was to proclaim the gospel and make disciples. And that was all he asked us to do. He didn't ask us to start a women's meeting or a men's meeting. He didn't ask us to start a food bank or hold services on Sundays or any of these things. These are incidental, and they're fine, and they're good. There's nothing wrong with them. They're things that we should do, but if it's at the expense of the one thing that we must do, that Jesus asked us to do, that's where we're going to be tested. We stand before him. He's not going to say, did you have a lovely women's meeting in your church, or did you run a food bank? All of that is good. It's good missional stuff, but he's going to say, did you help people to hear and understand the gospel that brings change and eternal life? This is another useful quote, and this came at the end of a small one-day conference in the east of England, and it was focused on rural churches. We had leaders from rural churches across the denominations came together, and at the end of the day we had a question panel, and somebody at the back of the meeting stood up and said, I found today to be inspiring and helpful, but the reality is I'm going back to my small village church, and we just do not have the resources to do what we would like to do for God. Now, that's quite typical of the attitude of many rural churches. We do not have the resources to do, overwhelmed by the challenge, and a sense of being underwhelmed by the resources that are available. Well, when the question was asked, I didn't have an immediate response I could make, but the man who was on my right on the panel stood to his feet and he said, brother, don't you realize God has already given you all that you need in order to do what he is asking you to do right now? Now, if your vision, and you've prayed about your vision, it's not now your vision, but it's the vision God has given you. This is the dream that God has given to you. It's what Nehemiah received, and that's what we ought to be looking for. So we test our dream, our vision in prayer. And if it is from God, then he will provide all the resources that we need. And maybe it has already done that, and we just haven't recognized it. Now, he might not give us everything we need to complete the dream or the vision. That's not the point. He gives us everything we need to make a start, just what we need to do right now. So identifying those resources is really important, and you could take a few moments to reflect on that if you like and have some sort of conversation about those two particular points. Do feel free to stop the presentation and hold a discussion. We move on, and another aspect was that Nehemiah had to make a start. Nothing would have happened if he just stayed there and prayed and made plans and so on. He actually had to do something. Now there are three questions that we could ask about our own situation. Okay, if we're not happy with the present circumstances, what's the problem? Okay, if, for instance, our concern is about a lack of numerical growth, what's the problem? Are there people in the area? Is the population diminishing, or is it stable or growing? What's the problem? Okay, can you identify what the problem is? And then can you say, what's the cause of the problem? Now, it may be that we need to be brutally honest and say, okay, the cause of the problem may be the way we are. It may be us. We may be in the way of what God wants to do. Maybe we're a congregation that's resistant to change, or maybe we're not prayerful. We don't have a prayer meeting, or we don't have a mission statement. What's the cause of the problem? And then what needs to change? Okay, and that's what Nehemiah had to do. Now the problem for him was that the walls were broken down and the gates were open. What was the cause? Well, it was backsliding. The people of Judea had abandoned God and his ways, and idolatry had come in, and there's all sorts of things that were corrupt and sinful. That was the problem. That was the cause of how they got into it. What needs to change? Well, they needed to get back to living God's way. So it's quite clear. And again, in the story of Nehemiah, we find how they learn God's ways, and the Spirit of God moves among them, and they resolve to live God's way. So think through those three steps. Again, if you need to pause the presentation, please do. If you want to do some work on those three questions: what's the problem? What's the cause? What needs to change? Feel free to pause the presentation. Now, once we've done these exercises, perhaps this sort of thing might be helpful as we try to work out how might we move out of the situation and move forward. Now, this particular diagram is helpful. It's used in business management. You may be familiar with similar cycles. You move around in a clockwise direction. I'll just quickly talk you through each of the stages. But I've got a handout which I'm happy to send to you. Drop me an email saying, can I have the organizational development model? I'll send it to you in a printed form, and you can print that off and use it. Now, basically, we start at the top by saying, okay, what's the current situation and what's wrong with it? Okay, then we move in a clockwise direction to implication. What's going to happen? Excuse me. What's going to happen if things do not change? So if we're not growing, well, then people are going to start dying off, and the church is going to eventually close. That's the implication of that. But there may be a different implication for whatever problem you're working with. And then the education process is, okay, you might find a church that found itself in a similar situation, and they've managed to turn that around. How did they do it? So maybe there are books that may be helpful. Maybe there's a course you could go on, various things. So the education process. Now notice again, the thing to do is get everybody involved in this process. Everybody involved in looking at what the problem is, what the implications are, and exploring the possible ways forward. And from that, you start to formulate strategies, and you might find it helpful to have a little table. So there may be a number of missional objectives, and you do those in vertical columns, and horizontal columns might be different strategies you might use to meet the ends. Now, let me give you an example. I worked with one church, and they had three particular missional strategies. There was a particular housing area in their community. There was nobody from there connected to the church, and so they wanted to evangelize that particular area. They were concerned about reaching men, so that was another issue that became an objective. And a third objective was young families. They wanted to get young families. So those were the objectives, and then we looked at different kind of strategies that might be possibly used, different kinds of activities, and where the table to the vertical lines and the horizontal lines cross, we put a score in, a figure out of 10. So if we thought it was going to be highly likely that it would succeed, it was 10. If we didn't think it was such a hot idea for a particular thing, we would say naught. So we would do all of those things. And from looking at that, we could then become focused, having looked at several strategies on a particular strategy. We've determined what we're going to do. We then implement what we're going to do. And then after we've done it, sometime later, we evaluate it. Now, don't worry if it doesn't succeed. Just failure to succeed isn't total failure. It just means you've got to readjust and learn some more. So that's fine. So again, you come back round the circle, full circle, and look at it and try something else, work something else out. Now, this is very mechanical. So I just want to remind you about Nehemiah's prayer and our utter dependence upon God. In the Old Testament, there's a verse, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. And another one, unless the Lord builds the house, they labour in vain that build it. So really, we're dependent on God, not on clever strategies. Clever strategies are fine, they've got their place, but we don't do them separate from our dependency on God and our prayers. Now, another interesting thing to consider is, particularly as so much of our church is focused on Sundays, is to ask, what is the market we're operating in? Now, you might say we're not in a market. What are we to do with a market? We're not selling anything. Well, in a sense, you are. We're proclaiming the gospel, and we're trying to encourage people to turn to Jesus Christ and put their faith in him. So we've a message and an objective, so that's quite clear. But where are we operating? Now, when I did my business management studies many years ago, one of the tutors asked us a question about Parker pens. Now, this was back in the 1980s, so if you're old enough to remember life in the 1980s, you'll find this exercise easy to do. If you're too young, well, stick with it, you'll understand in a moment. What marketplace, what market segment was Parker pens in? And of course, it was easy to think they're in the writing implement business. So who are their main competitors? Well, maybe it's Bic, which is a manufacturer of cheap writing pens, ballpoint pens, or maybe it's somebody like Schaefer, that's more of a quality pen. So who's the main competitor? Now, we struggled with that, and then he told us, and we were really surprised, I'm sure some of you will be too, that the main competitor in the 1980s was Ronson cigarette lighters. Now, why? Why? The answer is that Parker pens were really in the gift business. Most people that bought Parker pens bought them as a present to give to somebody else, maybe a reward for achieving something. So they were in the gift business. And the other popular gift in those days, when people do silly things like smoking, was a cigarette lighter, quality, nice looking cigarette lighter. So if we are mostly, if not totally, focused on church on a Sunday, that's the main expression of the life of your church, then you're trying to grow that. What market are you operating in? Now, you might say we're in the religious business. Well, okay, you are, but you're actually operating in the leisure market, and your main competitors are the supermarkets and the sports arenas, the gyms and so on. So that's the competitors. So you need to think in terms of how do you relate to that market in what you do. Again, it's a big subject, and I'd be happy to work with you if you want to think that through some more. There isn't time in this presentation. But take some time to actually look at your image, because, you know, when we have various things that give out signals, and sometimes these signals actually speak louder than the sermons in our church. So with regard to what we're trying to do, we need to think about, are we displaying a good image, or is the image actually undermining what we're doing? Is it actually working against our mission intentions? So take a moment to consider some of these things. You can pause the presentation in a few moments and have a conversation. But what image would you want to project? So here are some suggestions of different parts of the church you might want to think about. Does your building exterior, is it helpful? Is the interior helpful? Notice board, do you have one of those horrible black notice boards with gold lettered Gothic writing that seems to suggest you're old fashioned? Is your church magazine full of commercial advertising? You know, what's it there for? I mean, do you produce a magazine to sell people's products and services, or is the aim of your magazine for something else? So all of these different areas. Thinking of your church, you know, we often talk about hospitality, and we like to think our church is welcoming, but is it hospitable? You know, do people feel welcomed guests when they walk through the doors of your church for the first time? And what about the toilets? Are they clean? Are they bright? Are they sweet smelling? Do you use quality toilet paper? Or are you using everything that's cheap and, you know, it's not nice? You wouldn't do it in your own home. Why do it in your church? And of course, language. So often we use religious jargon, which is unhelpful. So what kind of image do you want? Here are some suggestions. You could write these down, or, you know, particularly emphasize some. You might want to prioritize these in some way. So you can take a few moments just to pause the presentation, look at that, but you also need to look at the next one. And the next one is, what kind of image do you not want? So here's some negative thoughts. Irrelevant, boring, self-interested, anachronistic, judgmental, out of touch, and dull. Now I wonder if you'd ever be brave enough actually to do a survey, a house or a street survey, and write down the positive points that were on the previous slide and the ones that are here, and actually go out with a clipboard and ask people which words they most associate. If you were to say, of all these words, which 3 or 4 words do you most associate when you think about church? I think you might be shocked with what is. I wonder if this would be of interest to you. Many years ago, I asked the friend of a friend who was a commercial artist if he would draw a cartoon for me of what he thought church would be like if he went to church. That's himself on the left-hand side of the picture. So, relatively young man, and obviously dressed in casual clothes, and he's saying, I don't think church is really for me. And why not? Well, he thinks that's mostly older people, middle class, rather judgmental. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? That's actually a cartoon produced by a non-Christian of what he thought church would be like. Sadly, I wasn't able to ask him to experience the church at the time where I was a minister and then do a cartoon of what it was really like. But we've used this many times. It's been a helpful thing to reflect on how people see us. Now, we may see ourselves differently, of course. So it's useful to do a little bit of research, and we could start with ourselves, do a little bit of audit ourselves on our image. So we could look at those different parts that I listed earlier and ask questions. Do these help? Does the building exterior indicate welcome and life, vitality, or is it rather drab and unattractive? What about when you come in? Is it well lit? Is it warm? What about that notice board? You know, I was in Perth in Scotland on one occasion, and I was walking down a main road, and I came past a place where there was a church, and it had a rather small, drab notice board that said, "The Gospel of Jesus Christ is preached here Sundays at 6 or 7." And that was all it said. It didn't look very welcoming. A little bit further down, there was a closed church that had been turned into partly restaurant and partly a nightclub, and it had lots of photos, and it showed what went on inside. So if you went into this place, you had to push into the interior, you would find all sorts of things. So tables loaded with lovely food, it looked really nice, and people having a great time. So it looked full of life and vitality. What about your church magazine? Have you had a makeover with it? You know, what are you trying to communicate? What's the message you want your magazine to give to those who read it? And what about the toilets? You know, the quality of your toilets, all of these things. So do your own internal audit. Score each of these accordingly. Again, if you want to pause this and do that as an exercise, that's fine. Otherwise, we press on. Now, we do want to say that in all of these things, the main thing is to make sure that the main thing is what? The main thing, of course. Now, Jesus asked us to do one thing. He asked us to proclaim the gospel and make disciples. That's the main thing. That's what we're here for. We're not here, in a sense, to worship God in the sense of just telling God how wonderful He is. You know, it's great that we do say that He knows that we appreciate Him, and that's really good. But, you know, there's more to it than that. We're here to delight God by doing the things that He wants us to do. But how do we fit them in? It's not always easy to fit everything in. So this is a little exercise on prioritizing. And again, I'm happy to supply the materials that you can do this. So the white circle is the totality of the resources that you have in your church. And that's people, that's money and time. So think about the people resources that you've got, the money resources that you've got, the time that's available to be used, and you divide that up. So each of these colored circles represents a different aspect of the life of the church. So it might be pastoral work, it might be teaching, it might be music, it might be evangelism, and so on. And you draw circles, and you sometimes need to do this several times. So I'm quite happy if people have several sheets of paper and try it several times so they get it right. But you start off with the way things are right now. So let's just imagine this is a church where the large orange circle represents music, all the people in the choir, the organ, how much we pay getting that serviced and so on. So that represents things the way they are. And we might imagine that one of the smaller circles that are here is actually going to be the work we do in evangelism. Imagine it's the green one. So having drawn it the way that it is now, the next challenge is to redraw it the way we think it should be. And it may be that you think that this green circle, which is the missional one, that needs to be larger, and that therefore we're going to make it bigger. Oh dear, how are we going to do that without overlapping any of the other circles? And that's part of the rules. You don't overlap. So, okay, if we're going to make it larger, the only way we can fit it in is for something else to be smaller. And that's the reality when it comes to prioritizing, that you've got to think it through and work out, okay, if we're going to make changes, what are the implications when it comes to these changes? So you need to ask, how are we using these resources, the people, the time, and the money? And on the subject of people, I want to just say something about how we use people in our churches. I hear an awful lot these days about lay participation, lay leadership. Congregational churches have been practicing this for years and years because we believe in the priesthood of all believers. But so often when we're talking about lay involvement, we're often talking about taking the professional minister or the vicar's role and dividing that up, or taking parts of it and finding people to do parts of it. So in a sense there are specific roles and we're trying to fit people in. And it may be that we get a good match or a nearly good match, or maybe we're not. So just thinking about the welcome of your church, you've got somebody really good at hospitality on the door of your church, somebody warm and welcoming who's not just going to say hello, but how are you? It's nice to see you. Show them where they can sit down, tell them where the toilets are, you know, make sure that they're fine, and if they've got a hearing aid, are they somewhere where they can pick up the loop signal and so on. You know, really good, caring, hospitable people on the door, so important. But I've been to so many churches where you get somebody who looks quite miserable and gives you a rather weak handshake and then thrusts a couple of books into your hand. It's just not good enough. So what I want to say is start with the people. what kind of people we've got. You know, God uses who we are. He'll give us gifts. He'll give us particular gifts to support the ministry he has for us, but he'll use our natural gifts, he'll use our personality, and he'll use our life experience. So what are these? How do these work? So who's the ideal person for doing pastoral work? Who's the ideal person for evangelism? Many years ago at a conference, I was told that the Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena in the United States had done some research, and they reckon that 1 Christian in 10 had the gift of an evangelist. Now, at that time, I was the pastor of a church that had 70 people on a Sunday, and I looked at that 70 and I thought, who is there that's confident in their faith and is not embarrassed to talk about their faith with other people? And using that as a criteria, I should have been able to find 7 out of 70 people, my 10%. In actual fact, I think I found 8 or 9 people who were either already doing evangelism or who could be potential evangelists. And then we can train them and encourage them and develop their gifts and skills. And we can do that for pastoral ministry, administration, and each of the different things. Now, coming back to tasks, which I mentioned earlier, just a few words just before we close. You know, when you're setting tasks or you're setting goals, always make sure they're smart. Keep them simple. Make sure they're measurable so that you can assess what you're doing, that they're achievable. Okay, so you know that, yeah, we could achieve this at a certain time, and that they're realistic and they relate appropriately to your goals. So all of these things are important. Smart goals. And I want to say this is so important. When you have a deacons meeting or a church meeting or a PCC meeting or an AGM, please make mission review the first and the main item on the agenda. That's what you're here for. What is your mission? What is your vision? Put it at the top of the agenda each time. Spend a reasonable amount of time looking at that. Okay, it's the main thing. If you were running a business to sell shoes, okay, and you have a business meeting, well, you're going to be talking about sales figures and how they're working. You're not going to be spending time talking about various aspects of administration and whether you've got the minutes correct. It's much more important. Those things are important, but give time and place to your mission review. So thank you for taking time to work through this presentation. Please note the contents are covered by copyright. There is some material in there which I've borrowed from other sources, and I've given the credit for those here. Do go and look at free Bible images if you've never seen those before. Excellent resource that you could use in your church. So finally, drop me a line. Send me an email. Let me know how things are. What are you doing about your dream? Share your dream with me. I'd love to hear what your dream, what your vision is, and what you're doing about making your dream a reality. So thank you. It's been great to share this with you. I hope you found it helpful, and if we can help you further by developing any of these aspects further in any way, you only have to contact me at these details. Drop me a line at barry@ruralmissions.org.uk or write to me at 4 Clarence Street, Market Harborough, LE167NE. May God bless you as you dream and work to make your dream into a reality. God bless.